So you may remember this car. This is the used car that we bought for $800 and, oh, wait, hold on. This is the car that we bought for $800. Sorry about that. I know, I suck with the camera. But this is a follow-up to the previous videos where, if you remember this car, I did a rather extensive used car inspection for a customer of mine for a car under $1,500, and this was the one that I selected despite it having some flaws to it, especially a number of check engine light problems, which we're going to go over in this video. And we did end up getting the car for almost half the asking price, largely because of the check engine light situations with this car. So what we're going to do here is I'm under a little pressure now, because since the customer has bought the car and he's got a maximum budget of $1,500, I've got to now prove that I am correct, that the problems with this car are going to be very minor and not expensive to repair, so that we can get him to the inspection, get his emissions done, and then he's good to go, get his license plates, and have a nice, reliable car to use. But all of this is for naught if I find that I can't fix the problems very easily. So I'm a little bit nervous maybe, but then again, I've always figured my way out of these things, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to use rational, logistic approach here to not just throw parts at this car and try to replace everything that the check engine light says might be wrong. We're going to diagnose exactly what's wrong as usual, only replace parts if necessary, and keep our price and our time commitment as minimal as possible, mostly the price. So let's see how this works out. So here at my trusty auto tap scan tool, we see we've got a number of check engine light codes, engine coolant temperature circuit, we got some oxygen sensor codes, always oxygen sensor codes, and it's never the oxygen sensor, and that's why oxygen sensors are always replaced, and the check engine light still comes back. We're not going to make that mistake. Admittedly, I'm a little worried about this camshaft position sensor code here. That's kind of a different one for me, so we'll worry about that in a minute. But also we got an EGR code. Now, interesting thing, by the way, about this EGR code, in that video where I was showing how to do a test drive on a car, I said to do 2 drive cycles on the test drive. And as a matter of fact, this EGR code came up on the second drive cycle when we were on the highway on the way back to the seller's house. So had we not done 2 test drives, we would have not seen this pop up. And as a matter of fact, us getting this $1,500 car for only $800, a major part of that was this code popping up as we were driving it, and it kind of freaked out the seller into maybe giving up the car a little bit more out of panic. So the obvious elephant in the room here is, where are we going to start? We've got all these codes here. So what I want to do is try to look for any kind of systems here where some of the codes may be reliant on others. Generally, actually, that won't happen, by the way. These codes are pretty well engineered. Usually, when you have a code, it is because other codes have been excluded. And other times, if you get a code, it will exclude downstream codes. So for example, if you have a code which indicates that maybe the oxygen sensors are a problem, you will not generally get a code indicating that there is a catalytic converter inefficiency, a lean condition, a rich condition, that kind of thing, because those codes, the catalytic converter, lean or rich, those depend on the oxygen sensor to come to that conclusion. And if the computer is suspecting the oxygen sensor is bad, then it generally won't give those downstream codes. So I'm going to keep this in mind as I take my approach to how I'm going to do the first step here. What I'm going to do for the first step is, because I know that the exhaust gas recirculation code here, the EGR code, is going to be kind of its own thing, separate from whatever might be going on. I can see where a coolant temperature circuit may have some relation causing these oxygen sensor things. But this EGR code is going to be relatively easy to diagnose. It's its own independent system. It's not that complicated. And I'd like to check that off the list first. So this guy right here is the EGR valve, exhaust gas recirculation. What that does is, when the engine is moving along under load at higher RPMs, especially like on the highway, for a few minutes and the engine's fully warmed up, it's going to recirculate some of the exhaust fumes to go back through the intake, and it's going to basically, the main thing with it is it helps to reduce emissions by recirculating some of those unburned exhaust fuels. Instead of sending them out the tailpipe, we can reburn them in the combustion chambers. This EGR valve should only be working when the engine is running along on the highway under higher RPM. If you activate the EGR valve when the engine is idling, it will probably kill the engine. It'll certainly make it stumble real bad. And I'm actually going to take advantage of that by activating the EGR valve while the engine is just idling, seeing what reaction I get, and that will help me diagnose whether this is a bad EGR valve or whether it's some other system where changing the EGR valve would have been a waste of money. Again, just because it mentions EGR valve on the code, that doesn't mean that you just changed the part. All it's saying is that it's detected a problem with that system, not with that part. So on this EGR valve is this vacuum hose here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach a vacuum pump onto this vacuum port. When we apply vacuum, if the diaphragm in the valve is good, it will lift the diaphragm and then allow those exhaust gases to come into the intake. Again, if the engine is idling when this happens, it should kill the engine. So we're going to put a vacuum hose onto the EGR valve there, and then the other end is going to go to a vacuum pump. You could also suck on the hose, but I don't want to suck in any exhaust fumes and kill any more brain cells that I can't afford to lose here. So the first thing I'm going to do is, before I start the engine, I'm going to go ahead and I've got my Mighty Vac hooked up to that EGR valve. I'm just going to give a few pumps here, and let's see. So you can see the needle's moving and it's holding. So this is indicating to me that this is good news, actually. This means that this valve is almost certainly in good condition. We aren't going to have to be likely to replace this EGR valve. So already saving some money for the customer there. What this may be is a blockage of the valve causing this issue, or maybe a vacuum leak leading up to the valve. But just that little test right there tells me that I suspect that the valve itself is going to be okay. So let's go ahead and start the engine and apply the vacuum. Again, if the engine dies when I apply the vacuum, then something leading up to the valve is the problem. If the engine does not die, that's going to be almost 100% confirmation that there's a blockage in the valve or in the passageway into the intake. So let's see what happens. All right, so I'm going to apply vacuum. And absolutely nothing is happening, nothing at all. So this is great. This is indication that the valve is fine. Everything leading up to the valve is fine. This is going to be a blockage of the EGR valve. All right, so I've removed the valve, and you can see that this hole right here is all filled with carbon. So all I'm going to do to fix that is just take a screwdriver here and remove, it's a little goopy there. Just remove that carbon, and once I finish cleaning this out, we'll see if we get an improvement in the EGR performance. After reinstalling the EGR valve now, I'm going to go ahead and reconnect my vacuum pump there. And the other thing too, don't forget, before you reinstall the EGR valve, clearing out that carbon from the hole on that EGR valve is one thing. You also want to make sure that you clear out the carbon on the back of the intake manifold so that there's no carbon blocking the hole on the intake manifold side. Obviously, replacing the EGR valve after cleaning it or putting a new one on would do nothing if that hole is also clogged with carbon, which this one was not, but I wasn't able to show you a camera angle because it's too close to the firewall. So I'm going to go ahead and fire up the car now, and I'll bet the car dies now. Let's go ahead and add some vacuum and watch it die. There we go. Cool. All right, that wasn't so bad. That was actually one of the first car repairs I ever learned how to do on my own, by the way, so I'm usually pretty good with EGR valves. All right, problem fixed. On to the next one. So now, what I want to tackle next is actually this engine coolant temperature sensor issue, and here's why.